evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the Minister for Justice and Counter-Terrorism, Michael Keenan. Dr. Raihan Ismail from the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies at ANU, counter-insurgency expert and strategic advisor to the US and Australian military, David Kilcullen, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Tanya Plibersek, and the Europe correspondent for Israel's Yedioth Ahronoth newspaper, Eldad Beck. Please welcome our panel. Well, thanks very much. And you can join the Twitter conversation by watching Q&A live on ABC TV, or if you live in Queensland, South Australia, the Northern Territory or Western Australia, it's simulcast on ABC News 24. And you can listen live across Australia on News Radio. Tonight, we're shifting the focus from domestic politics to the international and security challenges facing the nation. Our first question comes from Patrick Cooney.
Good evening. Israel to date has not been attacked by ISIS. In fact, they haven't even broken a window in Israel. Is this because that they know that understand that Israel will deal ruthlessly with such attacks? But here in the West, we seem to be very cautious about dealing with these attacks in terms of infringing human rights and offending the Muslim population. Bearing in mind that David Kilcullen has stated recently that a Paris-style attack is inevitable, isn't it time we adopted the Israeli mentality in dealing with terrorism and their fellow travellers appropriately? Like Israel, it's a struggle we can't afford to lose. David
Kilcullen, we'll start with you. What do you think about that notion?
Well, it's an interesting point of view, Patrick, and as I interpret the question, what you're saying is, you know, have we been a little bit too soft-handed here and given too much attention to human rights and to sort of religious freedom, and maybe we need to be a little bit hard-handed? Look, I sympathise with the point of view that maybe we need to hit these guys pretty hard, but I think it's worth remembering that the people we're dealing with, ISIS, the successor organisation to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, their specialisation is provoking sectarian conflict and trying to get different groups of people fighting each other so that they can exploit that. So while we do want to, you know, take a hard hand towards terrorism, it's really important to ensure that we're not kind of accidentally generating the kinds of dynamics that give rise to that sectarian conflict at the same time. Now, it's a balance.
Just going back to the latter part of the gentleman's question, do you really think it is inevitable that there'll be an attack in Australia, another terrorist attack in Australia?
Look, I'm often asked that question, and I'm afraid that and of course I defer to the Minister's point of view here too, but I think that the answer to that is yes, that it is inevitable that we are going to see at least some kind of terrorist attack here in Australia. The question is, how bad will it be? How will we respond? How will we focus on consequence management and on recovery from that kind of attack? And I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I think we have to be realistic that if you think that the government can protect you from any kind of terrorist attack, you're living in dreamland. And just like these things happen in other countries, they will eventually happen in Australia also.
Raihan Ismail, you heard the question, the suggestion that we should adopt the Israeli mentality. What do you think?
I think, to be honest, that's what ISIS wants. They want an all-out war. And if we're going to adopt the Israeli method of just, you know, trying to destroy ISIS, you can't do that because you can't bomb an ideology. You have to deal with an ideology by trying to deal with unresolved political problems. And at the moment, when you look at Syria, there are unresolved political problems in Syria, in Iraq as well. That's one thing that you can do because really you can't bomb an ideology. And, you know, by trying to bomb ISIS and go all out, you're not solving the problem at all. And second, I would probably disagree with David there. When it comes to Australia, Australia is very different. I think the Australian multiculturalism is a good model in Australia. And I think, you know, we need to reinstate the spirit of multiculturalism in this country. And when you look at Muslims in Australia, what's the population? 2.2%. You know, it's a small number, and Muslims in this country, you know, better integrated compared to some of the European countries, for example. So we can't really exaggerate the threat of, you know, terrorist attack happening in Australia. One thing that's also, you know, quite important to keep in mind is the fact that when you exaggerate the threat, of terrorism in Australia, there are consequences. When you look at that, you are empowering ISIS because that's exactly what they want. They want you to think that they're a force, and they're a strong force, that they can come and attack you. You are empowering the rhetoric of ISIS. And that is something that we really have to avoid, because we can't let them dictate and make us afraid.
Let's go to Eldad Beck. We'll hear from all the non-politicians first. Is there anything Australia could learn from Israel, as the questioner suggests?
Well, first
or
of
the
all,
Israeli mentality, I think, was how we put it.
I hardly see any Israeli mentality or Israeli method. I would be very cautious about talking about such things and trying to not generalize, especially when it comes to Israel. First of all, I would like to correct the information which was given here. Israel was attacked by ISIS. Actually, there is a non-stop effort of ISIS to recruit Arab Israelis, Palestinians. ISIS is very much on the borders, on all the borders of Israel, going from the south to the north. The fact that Israel hasn't been attacked directly or hasn't been declared directly a target of ISIS shows that ISIS has now other worries and other targets.
But in fact, Baghdadi, the supposed chief of ISIS, did issue a direct threat to Israel and warned online that ISIS jihadists would soon come and take over Israel and slaughter all the Jews. So, I mean, it has actually been said.
The issue of Israel is extremely interesting. Take Al-Qaeda. When Al-Qaeda bombed the States, they came up with declarations not mentioning in a word Israel. And at a certain point, they understood that including the Israeli issue would make them more popular in certain parts of the world. And this is the moment when they started attacking Israel. The same thing is happening now with ISIS. Israel is not a priority.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go back to our questioner, Patrick. I don't know if you want to get involved, but if you do, please feel free.
It's just a feeling that, that you might hate Israel, and a lot of people do, but they respect them. And a feeling in the West is that there's this sort of confusion. I mean, you look in the UK where there's demonstrations when the bodies coming back from Iraq. There was demonstrations about the Iraq war with Muslim leaders and clerics spouting a lot of hatred, etc. And they just get away with it. It seems as if that plays into the terrorists' hands. They are dividing the people and they're causing confusion. It just comes across that Israel is a lot stronger. They've been doing it since 1948, and they know what they're doing. And they may not be a priority, but maybe that's because they know the rules. Okay. In the Middle East, it's a rough area, and there's a line. If you cross that line, you're going to get a clap. And that's the way they deal with it.
Tanya Plibersek, I suspect a clap is like a clip, but
that's a smack. Yeah.
A smack. Okay. What do you say to the general notion that, from the questioner, that the Israeli mentality, the Israeli way of dealing with this, is something that Australia should learn from?
Well, I'm not sure that the premise of the question that Israel hasn't been attacked by Daesh or IS, whatever you want to call it, holds. As Eldad has said, there's been a series of knife attacks and attacks at bus stops and so on as well. But I think that you need to take a step back, I guess, and say one of the reasons that we have been cautious in our response when we've given extra powers to our security and intelligence agencies, we've also asked for greater transparency and accountability in the use of those powers, is because the civilisation and the society that we want to protect is one that values democracy, free speech, multiculturalism, all of the things that have made Australia great. And I think David's written about this in his book. He says, if you want to have perfect safety, you're going to have perimeter fences everywhere, you're going to have monitoring of the movement of people, you're going to have a great deal more intrusion into the lives of every citizen. So we need to balance up whether that's the society that we want, or whether we work with our security and intelligence agencies. Of course, our first priority is to keep Australians safe, but with those increasing powers in this changing world, we also accept that there should be greater accountability so that our democratic value systems protected.
Michael Keenan, we'll go back to the original question, and the gravamen of it was that Australia should be as tough as Israel, should learn something from the Israeli mentality when dealing with terrorists. What do you think?
Well, Patrick, I think we need to respond as appropriate to the situation here in Australia, and the security situation in Israel is significantly worse than we find ourselves in. Now, the security situation in Australia has got worse over the past 18 months, and we have, I think, responded appropriately to that. But we wouldn't accept in Australia, I think, the sorts of security measures that the Israeli government is required to take because of their very serious security situation. And I wouldn't want to see us go down that path, because I don't think that the threat that we've faced by the rise of ISIL is appropriate for that. But look, we have tightened up the legislative regime that our law enforcement agencies work under, our intelligence community works under. We've given them very significant extra resourcing to be able to deal with this. And I think that's the appropriate response. And we have actually been very successful keeping Australians safe. There's been 3 terror attacks in Australia, 2 on our police, 1 here in Sydney in Martin Place. But our agencies have stopped a further 6. So we are very successful in stopping these things from occurring in Australia. But I think our response has been appropriate to the scale of the threat that we face here.
Okay, we've set out some general principles, and I would ask our panellists, we've got quite a lot of questions to get through, to keep their answers short. And next question is from Zoe Hawkins.
Thank you. It was said before that you can't bomb an ideology, yet drone strikes are increasingly relied upon in the war against terror. It's been commented previously by many that this strategy may be counterproductive. So my question for the panel is, today, are drone campaigns an effective approach for democratic governments achieving their military goals without placing the usual burden of blood and treasure on their voting public? Or are the tactical successes of drones in fact far outweighed by their strategic futility and links with radicalisation?
We'll start with David Kilcullen, who's written a fair bit about this.
Yeah, well, so it's a complex question, Zoe, right? I mean, but I think the first thing to be aware of is that the use of drones has actually declined a lot in the last few years. There was a real peak between about the beginning of 2009 to the end of 2013, and then it began to drop away. I think that drones they're just an aircraft, right, with a bomb. So it's a question of who's on the ground, who's guaranteeing that the target is a legitimate target, who's deciding the overall strategy that the drone, fits into. And I think the drone is an example of kind of a light footprint approach that you're sort of pointing to, I think, where because we don't have to put our troops on the line, it's kind of easier for politicians to make decisions that may hurt other populations but don't hurt ours. And I think that's a valid point.
It's also an assassination approach, a targeted assassination approach for the most part, isn't it?
Well, it can be. So again, drones can be used in a war zone as part of a broader, war strategy, just like any other weapon, or they can be used in some cases in areas where there's not a declared war. And I think when you get into that realm, now you're talking about, targeted killing or targeted strikes on individual targets or what we call signature targets in non-war areas. And I would suggest that you need a much higher burden of proof, frankly, before you want to commit to those kinds of operations. But the tool in itself kind of allows people to avoid that. One other comment, and I want to be brief here. We have created a set of international norms now which says it's okay to strike a target in somebody else's country in time of peace, as long as it meets our own domestic political and legal requirements. Once other countries have those kinds of drones, maybe we'll look back on that and say, it seemed like a pretty good idea at the time, but maybe not.
Michael Keenan, what do you think? And does Australia generally support the use of drones for targeted assassinations?
Well, I wouldn't characterise it as targeted assassinations. I mean, we are involved in a war, and I think we need to be using the technology at our disposal. But
when you go, I'm just sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt there. I'm talking about when specifically drones are used to seek out and kill the leadership of terrorist groups, which has happened quite a lot.
Well, I think that is part of a wider war, and I think that is a legitimate thing for governments to be doing. The Australian government doesn't participate in that directly, but of course our allies do, and we support them in those goals. I mean, these are the sorts of questions I think we do need to be asking ourselves, and we should have a robust debate about it. But from my perspective, I think we need to be using what we have at our disposal against a very vicious enemy. And I mean, a drone is really no different from an aircraft. It just happens to deliver its payload in a different way. And I'd be very keen for us to do whatever we can to keep on top of this enemy.
Raihan, Ismail?
Yes. If we're able to target terrorists directly, I think that's great. But the problem is that with drone attacks, you also cause a lot of massive, a lot of civilian casualties, and that has gone against, Western forces, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are concerns when it comes to civilian casualties. And the problem with that as well, it plays in the hands of groups, extremist groups, such as the Taliban, and also at the moment, the Taliban in particular, because they feel, they're getting local support, and that's something that we have to avoid.
Tanya, Plibersek.
Well, I think for both moral and strategic reasons, you have to avoid civilian casualties, and the rules of engagement that Australians are fighting under in Iraq and in the air missions over Syria are very tight and very clearly aimed to avoid civilian casualties. I think the problem that a couple of people have identified is you're relying on intelligence to call in airstrikes, and the intelligence in Syria in particular has been pretty poor up till now. The human intelligence is pretty hard to get and to rely on. That's why our Air Force has been very cautious in its targeting and has
Tanya Plibersek, to some degree you're anticipating a coming question, so I'll go straight to it, actually. It's a question from Luke Westlake, and we'll bring you back in.
So many have serious doubts about the effectiveness of airstrikes against IS. They're an enemy that's protected in some ways by the intermingling with the civilians, and many of the nations that have been involved with the airstrikes have had terrorist attacks. If Australia's goal is to either protect itself or to help civilians in Syria, then why is it conducting airstrikes in Syria?
I'll go back to Tanya Plibersek, who was halfway through answering the question, just to pick up on that point, and then we'll go around the panel.
Well, our primary engagement obviously is on behalf of the people in the government of Iraq, allowing them to defend themselves and their territory from attacks across the border that were launched from across the border in Syria. That's the reason we went there in the first place, and that's always been the basis of our intervention. I think the issue that you're identifying, though, of groups mingling with civilian populations is a fiendishly difficult one. I think at one stage there were about 1,000 different groups on the ground in Syria. David's probably got more up-to-date figures now, but it'd be impossible to know groups splintering, splitting. We've got the intervention now of the Russians, who are much less discerning in their targeting than we've been in our targeting, and have not hesitated to drop bombs where they've known there'll be large numbers of civilian casualties. And you've still got the Assad regime that's killed probably 9 or 10 times more people than Daesh or IS has killed. So I don't think, while your question is a valid question, how do we make sure we're getting the right people, there's not a simple answer to this one. This is one of the most complex theatres of war that you can imagine.
All right, let's go to the government side. I'll hear Michael Keenan on that.
Well, again, I think these are the sorts of questions that we should be exploring. But the reason we're involved in bombing Syria is because this terrible organisation took over large swathes of that country, and they broke out and took over a very large part of the neighbouring country of Iraq. And airstrikes are part of the military strategy that we have in place to roll that back. It has been slow going, and it's already been pointed out by other members of the panel that targeting is fiendishly difficult, but airstrikes are part of making sure that we're degrading and ultimately destroying this organisation that we must do for the peace and safety of the world. So we will continue to do that regardless of the complexities that are involved.
And I think you do need to say, Michael, as well, that actually this, while the progress is very slow, territory is being reclaimed from IS. Their supply routes are being cut off, towns are being taken back. It is difficult, and I don't think anyone would be sanguine about the situation at the moment. But
okay, Tanya, I'm going to bring in David Kilcullen. You've looked at this very closely and the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. What do you say?
Well, I think that it's certainly been very effective in rolling back Islamic State in Iraq, where we've had capable ground forces to work with the air. Where you don't have a capable ground force, then you get into the sort of thing that Zoe was talking about earlier, where you don't really know necessarily who you're striking. And so I think, to your point, Luke, it's like, how do you set it up in such a way that you've got a capable ground force, you've got the kind of intelligence you need, and you've got the air asset all working together in kind of a team? That's actually really hard to do. When it works really well. I'll just make one comment. Australian aircraft, and I've worked obviously in a number of theatres where the Australian Air Force has operated, actually have a really good reputation for avoiding civilian casualties and for essentially not dropping ordnance if they're not 100% sure of what they're dropping on. And that's a well-known feature of Australian operational style, which frankly a lot of other countries don't follow.
Just briefly on the overall effectiveness of the bombing campaign, the coalition bombing campaign in any event, you've compared that to the bombing in Syria, to the NATO bombing in Kosovo and in Serbia, and the tempo of that first bombing in Europe was much, much higher. I mean, is this really an effective bombing campaign?
It has not been very effective to date, and that's in part because we haven't had the ground forces on the ground that we would need to make it a strategic success. But I just echo something that was said before. It's starting to get more effective in Iraq as ground forces are getting better, and we've taken the handcuffs off a little bit on our guys on the ground to enable them to target what they're seeing. So I think it is going to get effective. What I wrote in the book was just comparing numbers. You know, in the invasion of Afghanistan, the average number of strike sorties, so the number of aircraft doing a run per day, was about 110. During Kosovo, it was about 250. In the intervention in Libya, 2011, it was about 48. Over the first 18 months of the intervention in Syria and Iraq, across both countries, it was 14. Now, that actually shows you that huge amounts of care has actually been taken to not strike civilian targets, and it indicates how difficult the targeting is. But also, until you really crank up the pressure on the Islamic State, you're not going to start to see the effects from the air campaign that we've been looking for.
Eldad, how does this campaign, Israel has stayed out of the bombing for probably obvious reasons, but how does it look from your perspective as a strategy?
First of all, I'm not so sure I agree to the perception that you cannot bomb an ideology. I especially think about Nazi Germany. It was not defeated by roses and chocolate.
But no one's suggesting carpet bombing anywhere in the Middle East at this stage.
However,
apart from one presidential
and one
candidate.
should not forget that when the Germans were attacked, there were always also civilians who were attacked. However, one should have in mind the fact that victims number one of ISIS are Muslims. And Muslim countries are taking part in the war against ISIS on both sides of the front, of all sides of the front. And therefore, I do not think that we should look at it as a problem of the West. It's something much bigger, and it has an effect on many more people, mainly in the Middle East. And as the problem comes from the Middle East, I think it should, at a certain point, also be solved by the Middle East. And I would, you know, we are seeing all these refugees coming to Europe, to other places. I think that it would be wrong to start a discussion about integrating them in the societies where they're coming to. These people should get organized in order to free their countries. We could not have a Middle East free of all those good people leaving us and left to people like ISIS. Quite on the contrary, they should be mobilized in order to
I presume you're excluding women and children and the infirm and the elderly in that. I mean, are you talking about a capable force of men?
We have Kurdish women fighting against ISIS, so I would not say that women are out of this game. A woman that feels herself fit enough to fight, and I think it is a fight, a war also of women. It's a fight of minorities. And I repeat it again, it's the fight of the Muslims for their own life and future.
Okay,
yes.
Raihan.
Yes, I think I don't disagree with you when it comes to finding a regional solution. I think that is quite important, and it's a very good point to find regional solution. And perhaps forcing Iran and Saudi Arabia to come to terms and deal with the problems, particularly in the context of Syria and Iraq. However, when it comes to airstrikes, going back to your question, I think it's more difficult because, again, we have to look at civilian casualties. Last year, in Syria, the United States received bad intelligence and killed 60 people, and half of them were children. And that caused a lot of tensions. If you look at the images, on social media and what the people in the region actually talk about, they talk about American airstrikes. And ISIS used that to legitimize their fight against Western countries. And that's something that we have to be very careful. Again, I will go back to the idea, I know I'll be repeating myself a lot today, but going back to the idea that you have to look at unresolved political problems. You might be able to degrade ISIS. You will not be able to, perhaps you'll be able to destroy ISIS. However, there will be other groups that will fill the vacuum if you do not solve the problem in Syria and also the problem in Iraq. When you look at Iraq, you're dealing with the marginalization of Sunnis in Iraq. If you're not going to solve the problem or deal with the issue of the marginalization of Sunnis in Iraq, obviously you're not going to be able to defeat ISIS. So again, we can go and try and bomb ISIS, try and destroy ISIS if possible, but without finding proper, political or, try and deal with some of these political issues, I don't think you can ever defeat ISIS.
Can I just get a brief response? From what Eldad said earlier, which is the refugees who are fleeing Syria should somehow be mobilised and sent back to fight to free Syria. And I guess the question would be, free it from whom?
Yes, it's going to be very difficult because I'm half Egyptian, so I don't think I can fight, to be honest. It's going to be very difficult. I'm pretty tiny and small.
I don't think he was talking about you specifically.
No, I know. I'm just joking. But the thing is, going back, it's much easier for us to say that, they have to go and fight. But these people are fleeing tragic circumstances. They've lost relatives. And for us to ask them to go back and fight and risk their lives and risk their children, I think it is quite unreasonable, to be honest. So for me, it's really quite difficult to ask these women to actually go back and fight, particularly women and children.
Okay, let's move on because we've got quite a few questions, as I said, to go through. Our next question is from Paul Turner.
Russia has been waging a hybrid war in the Ukraine, and it seems to have had some success. Are they using same type of warfare in Syria, or are they using different tactics for their counterinsurgency effort? And in any case, is it working?
David Kilcullen brings the whole Russian picture into frame here.
Yeah, I mean, backing up to something we talked about earlier, if you want to see what a relatively unrestrained air campaign looks like, the way that the Russians are conducting themselves in Syria shows you, and Raihan's right, there have been some serious issues with Western airstrikes, but they're pale into insignificance compared to what's been going on under the Russian air campaign. The Russians in Ukraine and in Syria, in many cases, are in fact the same people. So the first unit that went into the Crimea in April of 2014 was a naval infantry brigade from the Black Sea Fleet. The actual same dudes were the guys who went into Syria last September, right? The same amphibious ships that supported the seizure of Crimea in 2014 supported the Russian insertion into the Tartus naval base last year. So they're running it as a single unified...
Tartus naval base being in Syria.
It's the key Russian possession in Syria. It's one of the big geostrategic goals that they're trying to achieve is to protect this warm water Mediterranean naval base that they've got on Syria's coast. They're using different tactics. In Ukraine, they've been working with a variety of irregular groups and militias and so on against a legitimate government. In Syria, what they've been doing is primarily backfilling the garrison duties of Syrian troops to free them up to go to the front line to fight against rebels, actually primarily not ISIS. And the Russians and the Iranians have essentially split the job between them so that the Iranians are kind of leading the ground effort and the Russians are leading the air effort. Right now, most of us that watch Syria closely are really worried about the potential for an encirclement of Aleppo, Syria's second city, and sort of the turning of an entire civilian population into a humanitarian bargaining chip in future peace negotiations. So again, strategy rather similar, but tactics kind of different.
Michael, what's the government's perspective on Russia's role in this and Russia's strategic goals?
Well, if I can make a distinction between the Ukraine and Syria, I mean, firstly, Ukraine is just an old-fashioned example of a bigger and larger neighbour using their superior military might to try and bully and intimidate a smaller country, and it's very much a David and Goliath battle, and I have great admirations for the Ukrainians, who are very much the smaller country who has been menaced by their larger neighbour in this instance. In Syria, I think there is an opportunity for Russia to play a more constructive role. That's open to them if they would like to be a part of a broader international settlement in Syria. I certainly hope that that would be the case, but obviously that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Do we have a view as to whether Russia is committing crimes here, as people have suggested, with its air attacks?
Well, it's very clear that they don't apply the same sort of caution that we apply.
But we consider those war crimes if they bomb civilians deliberately?
Tony, I don't know that it's that useful for me to characterise it in that way, but they are obviously not as careful in the way that they go about targeting the enemy in Syria, and we certainly wouldn't be conducting ourselves in the same way.
Raihan?
Yes, when you're looking at the Russians, I think I agree with Dave here. In Syria particularly, they've managed to also, degrade ISIS to some extent. And you look at the Russians, my colleagues at the ANU have discussed this actually, and they talk about carpet bombing or the Grozny model, where you demolish, flatten the area and then occupy. And definitely it's causing a massive humanitarian crisis. And Aleppo is we have to watch Aleppo because it's going to be really problematic looking at Aleppo. Also, the number of refugees that it's going to create. At the moment, the world is unwilling or unable to help with the refugees. And I think with the Russians, it's causing a lot of problem in Syria.
Also, what they're doing is propping up President Assad. Yes. It looks like he's going to be very difficult to leave her out of power.
Absolutely.
Have you come to the conclusion that actually now it's probably better that he remain in power?
I think with the Russians and the Iranians, they would like the regime to stay, not necessarily Bashar al-Assad. I think they want the regime to stay. And when you look at the Russians, Russia's involvement in Syria, obviously that's going to strengthen Bashar al-Assad or the regime's position. And that's going to force rebel forces in the opposition or Syrian opposition to negotiate, which is, it's painful for me to say, but it's not a bad thing. Obviously when we talk about Bashar al-Assad, he has committed, atrocities against his own people. Using chemical weapons, for example, against his own people. But at the moment, I think it's important for the opposition forces to negotiate. They're very reluctant. Perhaps they're going to say, we're not going to, negotiate Bashar al-Assad. He has to go, but the regime, we're willing to negotiate with someone else. So when you're looking at Russia, but Syria in particular, I think perhaps we'll be able to find resolution. It's going to take a long time, but that might work.
Eldad, you've obviously looked at this very closely, and I'm just wondering, do you have a perspective on whether Assad must stay in order for there to be some resolution to this?
I think we have to be more clear in choosing our words regarding Bashar al-Assad. It is not that he has committed atrocities. He has committed crimes against humanity, and therefore he should not stay in power. He should leave, and being backed by Putin, it's enough to let you understand the character of Assad and his regime. I absolutely agree with Raihan that we are going to have a situation which is going to take a long time before we get closer to a solution. But as Raihan said before, if we want to solve the situation in the Middle East, we have to tackle the basic problems of the region. And accepting such a regime, such a person who is responsible for the use of chemical and biological weapons against his own people, not against enemies, outside enemies. This is something that would only make the problems of the Middle East much, much more difficult. By the way, you were asking at the beginning of the program, is the war on Iraq the worst thing that has happened ever since Hitler took the war on
biggest strategic blunder or biggest strategic mistake, I think, is our.
We should not forget that there were many Iraqis who were freed from dictatorship by this war. And as a person who has been there after the liberation of Iraq from Saddam Hussein, I remember very well meeting Kurds and Shiites, and they are the majority of the population in this country, who were extremely thankful to all those who participated in the liberation.
Okay, just before I bring Tanya Plibersek in, I'm going to get David Kilcullen to respond to that, because the notion that the invasion of Iraq was the biggest blunder, a strategic blunder since Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, was yours.
Yeah, look, I stand by that judgment, and the reason that I stand by it is not because I disagree with Eldad. I think he's right about this issue of people being freed from dictatorship, but because, and in the book I spell this out fairly detailed, we turned away from a half-finished operation in Afghanistan, having committed ourselves to an enormous nation-building and stabilisation challenge to invade Iraq, and thereby went on a long and very bloody detour from the original set of strategic goals. We turned a one-front war into a two-front war, and we created an environment where we just didn't have enough resources to handle both. So in that sense, it's not only equally bad to Hitler's invasion of Russia, it's exactly the same strategic error, right? Creating a two-front war where you didn't have one before. That's not to liken us to the Nazis in any way, right? I'm not making that point. And you know, that's far from my mind. It's just that in terms of strategic decision-making, we are now still dealing with the outcome, or with the implications of that foray into Iraq. And yes, it had some incredibly important benefits for the Iraqi people, but it also generated, you know, at this stage about 270,000 deaths. So, you know, there's a balance here, and my view is it tends to be on the negative side.
I'm going to just come back to Tanya Plibersek to answer the point about Assad and Russia. With Russian support, it'd be virtually impossible to lever Assad out of power unless the Russians want it to happen. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess I'd take a different view from Michael on this. I think that the Russian intervention has been counterproductive in a whole range of different ways. The first is obviously this targeting of civilians, the loss of human life, of their indiscriminate bombing, obviously is a terrible new problem in this war in Syria. But the fact that they might back in Assad, who by some reports was only months from having to leave power, I think is equally terrible. So Syria will have gone through years of 6, maybe 7 years of bloody conflict, 400, maybe 470,000 lives lost so far, 11 million people displaced from their homes. All of that human misery to end up with the same government that caused this revolution in the first place just strikes me as an enormous human tragedy. And the Russians are deliberately targeting groups that are more or less in the middle, not Assad, not IS, groups broadly in the middle, because if they can clear the field of those groups that are broadly in the middle, they believe that the West will have to make a choice between Assad and Daesh. That's the choice that we'll be left with. That's their strategic gamble, and they're prepared for all of us to pay a very high cost, and the people of Syria to pay a very high cost for that.
And yet on the diplomatic front, the Russians, if you look at John Kerry and the Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, are partners for peace.
And if they can get a ceasefire that holds, even with the set of conditions around it that the Russians have put around it, then I'll be delighted if there is a ceasefire that holds. But it's a big if at the moment.
Let's move on to the domestic consequences of all of this, and we've got a question from Hussein Nadim.
My question is for Minister Michael Keenan. You recently introduced a policy to run CVE programs at school level to identify kids at risk. Having worked in this space for a couple of years, I have certain questions. It's a large question, but I'll break it down.
Can I just interrupt you, because CVE, a lot of people won't understand that CVE is countering violent extremism, so programs for countering violent extremism.
So my first question is that how do you identify kids at risk of radicalization, specifically when we're talking about kids between the ages of 6 to 14? Is Australia really under a security threat from kids 10 years old? Second question is that, do you not think this securitization of school space will eventually lead to further isolation of Muslim kids, racial profiling, and more radicalization, which, with all good intentions, you're trying to actually combat. Third question is that this program, Prevent Strategy, has already been applied by UK and other parts of the world. It hasn't really produced any results, as we can see in their monitoring and evaluation reports. I kind of fail to understand
Let's
why
try and
after
stick
4 years...
with the first question, and we'll come back to you to respond to what the Minister said. Okay.
Yep.
Well,
Michael Keenan.
Look, we're not changing the nature of schools, which are there to educate children. What we are doing is we're not having our agencies, by the way, identify children who we think might be moving down the wrong path. What we're doing is we're training people who are on the front line, such as teachers or others in the school community, to identify the sorts of signs that students might be exhibiting if they are moving down this dark path of violence and radicalisation. And the reason we're doing that is because here in Sydney we did see a 15-year-old shoot an employee walking out of work at the Parramatta police station. And we also know that ISIL is targeting people younger and younger. They were initially targeting people in their 20s, then they were targeting people in their late teens, and we now know, because we have good information about this, that they are targeting people in their early teens. It's a very unwelcome development, but we need to respond if we're going to do everything we can to keep the community safe. And part of that is working with the people on the front line to explain to them the sorts of behaviour that will change if somebody is undergoing this process. And that is what we're doing. We're not changing or securitising schools. That is not the way I would characterise it at all. We're working with education authorities to deal with a challenge that has unfortunately been presented to us.
Can I just, following up on one, and I'll come back to you in a second, Hussein. Who will be the judge of whether or not an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old is exhibiting signs of extremism?
Well, the point is that I hope that it doesn't apply to 8 or 10-year-olds, but it certainly applies to people in their early teens. They will exhibit certain behaviours if they have made contact with someone in the Middle East, if they're being groomed in the same way that a pedophile might groom a victim, their behaviour will change. And what we want is people who are the service providers, in this instance teachers or others in the school community, to be able to say, well, hang on, this doesn't seem right to me. That student's behaviour is changing in a way that is of concern to me. And of course, the earlier we can identify that, the earlier we can intervene, the earlier we can save that child from moving down this awful path of violence and radicalisation.
I'll just come back to the questioner, Hussein Nadim. Now, you suggested this could happen from the age of 8, I think?
From 6 to 14, from what I know.
6 to 14. So where do you get those figures from?
So a lot of these discussions that I've had with the policymakers and different parts of the world, we have seen that the age bracket of going into school starts from 6 and to the 14 and mostly in their teens. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the age from what I've gathered from the information that has been released.
Sorry, first of all, is that correct?
Well, it would be more concerned about children in their early teens, but as I said, there has been this process where ISIL continues to move down the age scale, if you like, and they're radicalising people. They're radicalising children who are younger and younger. And obviously, a government that seeks to keep its people safe does need to address that. But look, I really would reject the suggestion that somehow we're changing the nature of education or changing the nature of schools. We're giving teachers on the front line of this the tools to identify it and then to know what to do about it if they do identify it.
Raihan, can I just bring you in here?
Yes, of course. I just have one question, actually. Are we going to retrain teachers? Are we going to ask them to, take a degree in criminology? If you're going to, ask them to profile children? At the moment, we already have our intelligence agencies dealing with this. So when you're asking teachers to do the job of, intelligence, I just don't see how we're going to be able to do that unless we force them to go, for proper training.
Sorry, you finish and then I'll respond.
Yeah, and also I think when it comes to Muslims living in this country, it's already quite difficult. And you have children. How do you identify whether a child is being radicalized? If the child decides she wants to wear the scarf or the hijab, is that a sign that the child is being radicalized? If a child says that when I grow up, I want to wear the niqab, the covering of the face, is that a sign that the child is radicalized? So I think there are a number of questions that we have to ask before we actually agree to something like this.
Well, can I say to you, if you're undergoing a process where you're in touch with someone in the Middle East who has identified you as someone who's vulnerable to this sort of grooming, and they are trying to get you to commit an act of domestic terrorism. This does happen.
But why teachers? Sorry.
Well, if I could just finish. And your behaviour will change. It's not like you just pick up a gun one day and go and shoot somebody. I mean, there's a whole process that you go through. It can happen very quickly. And teachers are very well placed to be able to know that somebody in their class is having that changed behaviour.
Teenagers behave indifferently.
Of course,
I mean, when you were
you
16...
you do need to be able to identify that. And it's not just a matter of teenage rebellion. But if you, as I said, undergoing a process where the end result is you would undertake an act of domestic terror, this happens not just in Australia, it happens in other parts of the world, your behaviour in the lead up to that is not going to be the same as it was prior to that. And we're not changing the nature of teaching, but we're giving them an extra skill set to be able to identify it and say, well, there's something of concern here which we need to look into.
Just very briefly, have teachers across the country agreed to do this?
Well, look, we're working with state... I mean, we don't employ teachers. We're working with state education departments in a national project to counter violent extremism.
So is it at pilot stage now, or is it going to be rolled out across all teachers throughout the country at some point? Is that
look, it's not at a pilot stage, but there are small programs running, I suppose, in what we would consider to be the most vulnerable parts of the community at the moment. And it won't change the nature of teaching by any means, but it will give teachers an extra skill set. And it's about saving these kids. I mean, a 14-year-old kid, a 13-year-old kid is not intrinsically evil, but they can be radicalised to violence. We want to stop that from happening.
Sorry, let's hear from the rest of the panel on this. Tanya Plibersek, you first.
Well, I think our former ASIO head was quite right when he said our best ally in keeping Australians safe is making sure we've got good relationships with the Muslim community. And I think teachers will pick up if kids are going off track, but so will their families. And having strong community and family support to get them back on track is really important. We know that there are some dangerous, poisonous people, not just recruiting online, but also in our Australian community, trying to lead young people astray. And our first best defence against that is making sure that we've got good insights into the community, good communications, and that we pick that up very quickly.
So a degree of bipartisan support for the notion that teachers could be used in this way?
Well, look, I haven't seen the material other than the reporting of, I think it was Karen, the environmental activist, who was going to go out and chain herself to trees. That's the curriculum you're talking about, isn't it, Michael?
Well, no, it's not actually.
Well, what was that from?
Well, that was a publication that was issued by the department based on real-life case studies that were supplied to us through academics that study this. And that was an effort to explain the process of radicalisation and to use other examples besides someone who might be undergoing a process of radicalisation, Islamic radicalisation.
So you're watching out for Muslim extremism and environmentalism?
Well, I've got to say, I've got to say, Tony, I find nothing funny about any of this.
No, well,
I mean, it is a very serious issue and it's a very serious process of someone undergoing it. And that was an effort by the
Can you really
department
compare
to
those two
explain.
things, really, is the point?
Well, we weren't comparing the two things. What we were saying is that people can be radicalised for different causes, and the idea was that we weren't just focusing on one particular community. We were trying to broaden it wider. Look, perhaps in hindsight we might have been able to choose better examples than that, but they were real life case studies. I can assure you.
I'll just be very clear. I wasn't making a joke of this. I was just saying what matters is the quality of the materials and, as you've said, the quality of the training. If you do expect community members, parents, teachers and so on to pick up changes in behaviour, you've got to have good information about what to look for, and then you have to have somewhere to refer to.
I want to go to Eldad to hear, this debate must be a pretty live one in Europe and particularly in Germany where you are based. How are the Germans who are bringing in now hundreds of thousands of people handling these kind of issues?
As far as I know, it doesn't go into the education system yet. It is mainly done by the secret services of Germany, which have unfortunately proven to be very unqualified to deal with this problem in recent years. Let me remind you that the attacks of September 11 were actually planned and organized in Germany under the nose of the Germans. There are many other attacks that were taken place through or over Germany. So I would imagine that leaving this issue only to the secret services or the security services would not be a solution forever. I am not so sure about the incapacity of parents or relatives to detect processes of radicalization, and this is where I'm going back to the issue that I have brought before. I think that ISIS is by far most the biggest problem of the Muslims themselves. And what I lack is a reaction of Muslim communities in Europe and in other places against this threat. I have never seen, hardly seen, any huge Muslim anti-ISIS demonstration in Europe trying to stop the youngsters going to Syria and Iraq from joining this criminal organization. I think that here the part of responsibility of Muslim communities is very, very big, and I do not think that by accusing the others of being responsible to all the problems of the world, we shall get any closer to resolving a problem which, I repeat, is problem number one for the Muslims themselves.
Can I?
Yeah, a brief response if you would like.
Yes, thank you. When you look at Muslim leaders, they have denounced ISIS. A number of religious institutions in the Muslim world, be it in Egypt, be it in Malaysia, be it in Turkey, they have all denounced ISIS. And you correctly pointed out that Muslims, they've been, ISIS targets Muslims. And the number of, Muslims killed by ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So that's something that we need to consider. When it comes to Islam, there are a number of interpretations when it comes to Islam. There's so many schools in Islam, so many sects in Islam. And there's a debate between reformist Muslims and also establishment Islam, mainstream Islam, for example. And the debate happens here. And ISIS, you know where they belong? Outside. Muslim reformists and establishment Islam refuse to accept the legitimacy of ISIS. When you look at the Quran, there are a number of ways to interpret the Quran. For example, one verse contains multiple interpretations, and ISIS' interpretation of the Quran is rejected by so many Muslim scholars. I'll give you a brief example. Probably.
You have to be very brief.
I'll be very brief. For example, the issue of polygamy. So in the Quran, it states you can take 4, 3, 2, but if you cannot be just marry one. So reformist Muslims interpret the verse as, looking at the word just. Just means you have to be financially just, physically just, emotionally just, psychologically just, and therefore, because it is impossible to be just, the Quran promotes monogamy. And you also have others who would look at the same verse, a cult in Malaysia in the 1990s, which argued that let's add all the numbers, 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, and therefore it is legitimate to take up to 10 wives. So again, that's what ISIS, when you're looking at the way they interpret Islam, looking at verses, at the moment we are empowering them because we are debating about Islam within the framework established by ISIS. So that's something we have to avoid because there are a number of interpretations and they don't accept ISIS.
This has to be target number one of the Muslim society itself.
They are working really hard. They are saying, the number of, clerics who have condemned ISIS, even in Saudi Arabia, the most conservative state.
When we are coming to a situation when Saudi Arabia becomes moderate because it's moderate relative to ISIS, we have a huge problem.
Yes,
I'm going to go to a nearby neighbour that is actually a lot more moderate in its form of Islam. But remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and keep an eye on our Twitter account for fact checks by The Conversation or the ABC fact-checking unit. Our next question is a video. It comes from Andre Hidayat in Tungabi, New South Wales.
Indonesia has long promoted a tolerant form of Islam. Last January, Daesh announced its arrival and innocent people were killed. Indonesia is Australia's most important strategic partner. Is there scope for Australia to assist its closest neighbour with its tools of statecraft? Or can Indonesia and its form of Islam be enough to suppress another uprising?
Okay, it's an important question. We'll answer it briefly because we've got other ones to get through. David, I'll come to you because your original PhD was on Islamic extremism in Indonesia.
That's true, and in fact, Australia has a very long track record of working closely with the Indonesians on things like building investigative capacity, assisting the police, helping with things like funding of counter-radicalisation and a variety of other measures that have actually been extraordinarily effective. None of that would have worked without really strong leadership from Indonesian leaders themselves and a really strong rejection from Indonesian society against groups like Jamaah Islamiyah and now ISIS. So it's a great example of a partnership. One of the areas where Indonesia, I think, could do with a bit of help is in handling prison radicalisation and what happens to people when they get released from prison. The Indonesians would be the first to tell you that they would agree with that. And I think it's a great example of what can happen when neighbours partner together on these kinds of issues instead of people trying to impose a particular view on another country.
Michael Keenan, you would have seen this morning the ABC's Indonesia correspondent Sam Hawley reported on what appears to be indoctrination and recruitment by ISIS in a mosque in central Jakarta. So your response to that question in the light of the new information?
Well, I mean, we know that Indonesia, like other countries in the world, is susceptible, and there will be people within their population that are susceptible to this awful and violent ideology. But the Indonesians are very keen to work with us and others in the region to do all that we can to cooperate in eliminating it. I mean, David mentioned prisons. We do work with the Indonesian government on Indonesian prisons. In fact, Australia and Indonesia chair a working group for the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum on exactly that. And our relationship is very close. It has been since the first Bali bombings. Law enforcement agencies know each other well. They work very closely together. We share expertise, we share information. Others in the security apparatus also work very closely together and know each other very well. Politically, I mean, I've been up there twice in the past few months. Other ministers are up there. Their security minister has visited Australia as recently as November last year. The relationship is exceptionally close, and both Indonesia and Australia recognise this is a shared problem and we do need to deal with it.
How concerned are you about the appearance, the emergence of ISIS in Indonesia?
Well, very, because we don't want to see our neighbours under threat. And of course, we don't want to see Australian interests in Southeast Asia, Indonesia or any other part of Southeast Asia targeted. We've had experience of that. More Australians have been killed in terrorist attacks in Indonesia than the rest of the world combined. That relationship has got to be as close as humanly possible. We work very hard at it, and the Indonesian government are very keen to make sure that even when there's other road bumps in the relationship, and that does happen from time to time, that our counter-terrorism relationship continues unabated, because it is in both our interests to ensure that that's the case.
It's the largest Muslim nation in the world, so I'm just raising this in relation to what Eldad said earlier. Do you believe the Indonesian situation somehow is a counter to the argument that he was putting forward that there hasn't been a Muslim reaction?
Absolutely. I mean, Indonesia is the largest Muslim nation, but it's a multicultural country. They don't have a state religion. They actually celebrate the diversity that they have within their society, and it is a great model, I think, for other Muslim societies to look to. And the president there is keen to go out and preach the benefits of the Indonesian model because it works very well there. So the population that's susceptible to radicalisation is small, but obviously it can be very potent, because we can see that a small number of people with the right equipment can do an enormous amount of damage.
All right, I'll just bring in Raihan here quickly, if you wouldn't mind, because we've got another question to go to and we're nearly out of time.
Yeah, I think it's important to work with our, with our regional partners. I think I absolutely agree with that. And when we look at terrorism, I know we keep saying that, it's a Muslim problem. I don't think it is. I think it's a global problem. We're dealing with terrorism not just in Australia, but we're dealing in with the issue of terrorism in other Muslim countries. Muslim countries and also Western countries. So I think it's important to work with everyone when you're dealing with the issue of terrorism, because trying to paint it as only a Muslim problem, I don't think you're going to be solving the problem anytime soon.
Okay, Tanya Plibersek is can you keep it brief? Yeah,
no, okay. Very quickly. I agree with Michael that our cooperation with Indonesia has been very good, and it continues to be very good, even at times when the relationship's not 100% on track. But one of the things that we could be doing and should be doing and were doing in the past were investing in things like building schools. We built 2,000 schools in Indonesia through our aid program. And when you're building schools, it means that those kids who are going to those schools aren't relying on some of the more radical madrasas to get their education. The program that you were talking about this morning, that story about the recruitment, one of the things that the recruiter was saying to get people to go is come, you won't have to pay rent, you won't have to pay electricity, you'll get your health and education paid for. There is actually an economic appeal in some of this as well.
Okay, we're virtually out of time. We'll squeeze in one last question. It'll require short answers from Georgina Stojanovic.
My question is to David Kilcullen. David, the international community is facing a diabolical situation with fragmentation of states in the Middle East, in particular irrational state actors, in which I include ISIS, and perceived challenge to the US hegemony by China. What do you think is the potential for a hot war in either the Middle East or between US and China?
So I'll stick to the Middle East, and it's a great question, Georgia, because you know, we've been going back and forth about how best to characterise the threat. And actually, I think that the threat that's most severe right now is actually that of a state-on-state conflict in the Middle East, and particularly the humanitarian impact of that. And that vacuum in Syria and Iraq that was created over the last several years has now drawn in a number of regional countries. We haven't talked much about Turkey, but Turkey's at risk. The Russians are in there. We've got you know, many regional Sunni states participating, the Iranians, and of course, you know, we're in a position where a lot of ordnance is being brought into the region, and countries are intermingled in a very complex situation. And situations like what happened recently, where the Turks actually shot down a Russian aircraft over Turkish territory, just show you how it doesn't take evil intent. You can get accidentally into some pretty bad situations. I think the most important thing we can be doing right now is trying to make peace in Syria. And you know, if I was going to put one thing on the top of my list, it would be that, because the risk that you're pointing to is incredibly real.
Brief answers, everyone. Eldad, Beck.
It's a messed up situation, and unfortunately it's going to stay that way until the people directly involved are not going to take matters in their hands in order to solve their problems.
Raihan?
I think with Syria, it's going to be, you know, it's very difficult. I agree with everyone. It's going to take a long time to actually solve the problem in Syria. But again, we need to work really hard in order to find a solution in Syria. And I think it's important to force regional powers and also, you know, negotiate with the Syrian regime, with Russia. I know it's painful when it comes to the Syrian regime, but I think Assad is not going anywhere. And we have to accept the fact that he doesn't want to go anywhere. So, and also he's got the Russians and the Iranians backing him. So that's something that we're going to have to
Real
deal
politics.
with. Yep.
Tanya Plibersek.
Well, you know, when we thought Al-Qaeda was the greatest threat in the world, we thought it can't get any worse than this. And then Daesh, it got worse. And about the only thing that could make Syria worse is a hot war, because the implications for all of the powers that have used it as a proxy war to date, getting involved in a hot war, I think are beyond our imagining when it comes to how awful it would be. So you're absolutely right. Of course, we need to find a political solution as quickly as possible. And at the same time, I keep saying it, we have to be offering better humanitarian support than we are. 11 million people fled their homes, close to 500,000 deaths. We can do better on the humanitarian front.
Michael Keenan, we're virtually out of time. What is it that, put it this way, what is it that keeps you awake at night?
Well, we do need a political settlement in Syria, and until that happens, then the security situation in Australia is going to be worse. I mean, The whole basis of the problem we have is being exported from that war zone. And military might is not going to solve it alone. There does need to be a settlement. There's enormous challenges in terms of the superpowers that are involved there, but of course it does present us with an opportunity for all of those actors to behave in a responsible way to bring an end to this conflict. Now, that's not going to be easy. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but there is an opportunity, I think, for the international community to come together to do something positive to enforce a political settlement in Syria.
One where Assad might stay?
Well, the facts on the ground are the facts on the ground. And unfortunately, as much as, Tanya mentioned the Russians before, we don't welcome the Russian involvement, we never have. But the point is, it is occurring. And we do need to respond to the facts on the ground. That is the reality.
OK, that's all we have time for. We're over time. Please thank our panel, Michael Keenan, Raihan Ismail, David Kilcullen, Tanya Plibersek and Eldad Beck. Thank you very much. Next Monday Q&A will be live from Melbourne with the former Minister for Small Business, Bruce Bilson, Labor Government Speaker Anna Burke, the Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, Lyle Shelton, the CEO of the Roy Morgan Research Centre, Michelle Levine, and one other to be announced until next week's Q&A. Good night.